Jimmy, the finale. Prologue. 2317 AD. Dweezil stared up at the statue of Jimmy, a tear in his optical implants. He sighed and pulled the tech pad from his jacket pocket. He punched in an access code and watched the front display flicker to life. A calm female voice issued forth. Alpha public database access granted. Please make your inquiry. Record extraction requested. All files pertaining to the historical figure known only as Jimmy. Authorization code Dweezil 54 Gamma 9. The response was instantaneous, access denied. All records pertaining to that subject are restricted to security levels Omega 1 and above. Cross-reference files found. Suggest inquiry into DOA records. Dweezil cursed silently and glanced around him. This assignment was possibly the hardest of his career. He had spent the last 3 months undercover at the Jerry's Corporation, owned by the technology mogul Alejandro Bennett. It had taken him those 3 months just to find out that the statue existed. He had found the location on a private file in Bennett's office. Strangely, it had been on paper, not a tech pad. When he had found out that the location was the Undercity, located several miles underneath the Janesville Sky City, he had had to go to the editor at the New York Holo Times and get a special access code for transmat into the Undercity. His editor had told him in no uncertain terms that if he went to the Undercity and was discovered there, the Times would deny all knowledge of his actions. But Dweezil knew that his editor wanted him to get the story, no matter the cost. Dweezil glanced around in distaste. The Undercity was basically the rubble of a once great city, casually discarded when the Sky City was built 75 years before. He peered up into the murky sky and could just make out the hover thrusters of the Sky City. It seemed so far away. Dweezil pushed the thoughts of warmth and safety aside as new thoughts of the awards and the notoriety this discovery would bring him. He glanced at the tech pad again and made a request, access G Corp files. Authorization Bennett 120471 Omega 914. The tech pad was silent. The display unit flashed and Dweezil saw the logo for Bennett's company appear on the screen. He had never understood, it was what looked like a disfigured man, his head almost appearing to be a hamburger. Access granted. Repeat previous inquiry. The tech pad hummed and began to give out a series of beeps and whistles. Data retrieval in progress. Please wait. Dweezil put the tech pad on the base of the statue and pulled out a cigarette, lit it and exhaled. The smoke rose into the air and circled the body of the statue. Dweezil went to take another puff when the end of the cigarette suddenly sputtered and extinguished. Dweezil felt a cold rain begin to pelt down from above. Jagged streaks of lightning began flashing across the sky. Dweezil went to reach for the tech pad when he saw a shimmering light nearby. He spun around but already knew what was happening. He glanced back at the tech pad and saw a flashing icon. It was Bennett's personal identicon. Dweezil began running. Behind him, 17 blue-suited men materialized and shouted for him to halt. Dweezil ignored them and jumped over some rubble. He heard the whine of weapons fire and suddenly he saw the cracked pavement rushing towards him. Chapter 1. 2203 AD. The Degolier was heavily damaged. Life support was failing, and an engine containment breach was imminent. The bridge was in shambles, but everyone's attention was not upon the damage to the ship, they were more concerned with the arrival of the traitor Trudy, swearing revenge on the captain. Trudy stood, facing a stunned bridge crew. Tip was out of his chair, weapon in hand. Trudy whipped out a weapon and fired. Tip's body lit up a fiery red and melted away. Computer. Trudy called, initiate self-destruct sequence, authorization Trudy Delta 1-1-0 enable. Warning. Self-destruct has been activated. Self-destruct in 10 seconds. Trudy began to laugh an insane laugh. Nearby, a damaged vehicle, the Raptor, was experiencing a strange event. Its shields gone and engine also heavily damaged, It suffered a further shock when the Degolier began to list, a fireball erupting where the bridge had been. As the shock wave slammed into the Raptor, a shimmering glow enveloped the ship. Time froze. The temporal incursion shattered all spectrums of reality, and then as quickly as they formed they dissolved. But the structure of time/space in that sector was already changed. The flaming wreck of the Degolier was gone, to be replaced with a completely restored and fully functional battleship. The Raptor, too, was restored to its full capacity. On the bridge of the Degolier, the crew were aware of the change. Seconds before they had felt the searing pain of a fiery death as the ship exploded. Now they sat or stood in fresh, clean uniforms, staring at each other in confusion. Tip Ruckerman jumped from his chair, a weapon in hand. Trudy was about to destroy the shield's panel. Tip fired his weapon, her body taking the impact of the blast and slamming into the back of her chair as she melted away. "Sir! The Raptor, she's preparing to fire on us," called an ensign from the helm. Tip gritted his teeth and said, "This time we do it right. Lock diuranium torpedoes on the Raptor and fire." The ensign nodded and engaged the defense panel. 2 fireballs arced out from the bottom of the Degolier, streaked through space and slammed into the Raptor. The small ship spun wildly on its axis, the shields surrounding it flashing to life, trying to protect it. 2 explosions shattered the shields and tore into the vulnerable hull. The ship shuddered and then righted itself. The thrusters flashed and it began moving towards the Degolier at a rapid rate. On the Degolier bridge, the helmsman reported, "Her shields are gone and she has major damage to the hull. She's moving for a collision course." "Fire all weapons," thundered Tip. "She's too close to get a positive lock without damaging our ship," cried an ensign stabbing at controls. "Impact in 8 seconds, shouted the helmsman. "Sublight." "Now," said Tip, dropping into his chair and bracing for the jump. Seconds before the hull of the Raptor touched the hull of the Degolier, the larger ship blurred and was gone. The Raptor glided through empty space. The suddenness of the jump to sublight had caused various systems to overload and explode in sparks on the bridge. The ship lurched back into normal space, sending the crew sprawling. Tip had been prepared and held fast to his chair. "Report." An ensign pulled himself back to his console and croaked, "Ship-wide malfunctions and overloads. The engines are offline, and our weapons array has shorted out and fused tight. We're helpless. We must go back and destroy that ship," roared Tip. The ensign spun around, sweat glistening on his brow. "Sir. We're in almost as bad of shape as we were before, well before whatever just happened." Tip steeped his fingers together and leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. Chapter 2. 2002 AD. Darlene Lowe Pepper knew the enemy compound would be difficult to infiltrate, but she never expected it to be this difficult. She glanced at her fellow teammates, also clad in skin-tight white lycra. There was Trudy, an expert in ammunitions and foreign languages, wearing her black wolf mask. Then there was Karen, expert safecracker and the brain of the team. She wore camouflage green goggles which shot bolts of fire at anyone who opposed her. Last, but not least, was Carla, large black cannons attached to her wrists. The cannons shot radioactive volleyballs which destroyed anything and everything they met. Darlene gave the other girls the usual thumbs-up signal and whispered, "Okay, Power Girls. Let's go get 'em. It'll be as easy as ABC. Power Girls to the rescue. ABC. ABC." They shouted in unison. Hooting and hollering, they jumped from the bushes they had been hiding in and charged the compound. Black-suited guards spun around in shock and fear and began firing wildly into the night, trying to bring the Power Girls down. The guards watched in horror as their bullets bounced off the chests of the Power Girls. Lowe Pepper chortled and said, "Our Power Bras defend us from evil." As she leapt into the air and brought her boot crashing down on the chest of a guard. He was felled. She turned and used her fists of granite to knock out another guard. She saw that Trudy was pinned nearby by a guard. Raising her clenched fist in the air, she called out "Power Girl" to the rescue, and leapt at the guard, sending him crashing into a nearby wall. Trudy jumped to her feet and they did a high five. "Power Girl, power! Grrrrrrrrr," they squealed. Soon, all the evil guards had been vanquished. The girls all gathered into a circle, put their outstretched arms together and began chanting, "Go! Go! Power Girls! Yay!" Shortly thereafter, they calmed down and made their way to the compound. Darlene motioned Karen to make for the roof, and with one swift movement, Karen was in the air, shimmying up the slanted roof. Darlene gave Carla the thumbs up sign and Carla launched 2 volleyballs of destruction at the compound doors. They burst into flames and fell aside. The Power Girls let out a long hoo, 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 and rushed into the compound. Wham! Crash! Boom! Soon, it was all over. The Power Girls emerged from the compound, the plans for the disintegrator gun in their gloves. As they made their way back to the power van, Darlene recalled the events that had brought them to this point. Jimmy would pay for what he had done. Chapter 3. 1999 AD. Jimmy was nonplussed. Yes, it was an octopus, but what it was doing in his bathroom on that chilly March afternoon was beyond him. He coughed loudly, attempting to draw the octopus' attention. A set of beady eyes turned to study him. It was only now that Jimmy noticed the octopus had Jimmy's hairdryer in one of its tentacles and his toothbrush in another, the purpose for this, unclear. An awkward silence followed. Jimmy decided discretion was the better part of valor, turned and walked out of the bathroom and headed back to the living room, where he had left bride-to-be Carla sitting on an overturned milk crate. "Another octopus in the bathroom!" he exclaimed. Carla shook her head softly, her soft brown curls bouncing off each rosy red cheek with a sound akin to that of waves crashing on a beach. "What is that?" "Third one this week," she asked. Jimmy nodded, said, "I think we have a nest in the storm cellar or something," and plopped down into the fluorescent green bean bag next to Carla's milk crate. "Anything on TV?" she mused, turning to the 6-inch black and white set on the floor. "I dunno," he said as he reached over and flipped it on. Several minutes later, after the tube had warmed up, a tinny voice began to issue from the small speaker. "And in local news, local coat entrepreneur Jim Brenner has pressed charges against local man Alex Bennett for suspicion in the arson of his coat factory." Mr. Bennett was quoted as saying, "It's eye for an eye, you fat son of a." Suddenly, the small TV set exploded. Jimmy quickly fanned the flames into extinction and turned sheepishly to Carla. He thought he saw a vein on Carla's forehead pulse and twitch for just a second before she said, "Jimmy, I don't know how to say this, but I can't take this anymore. You're just too damn poor for me. And besides, the girls at Target are starting to talk. We're finished." With that, Carla dropped to the floor and shimmied out on her belly through the hole in the floor. Jimmy sat in stunned silence. The sound of breaking glass stirred him from his revelry. He grabbed a broom and made his way to the bathroom, muttering incoherently. Meanwhile, on the other side of town at the local Perkins, Darlene Lowpepper and Karen Marango were chatting over banana cream pie. "We'll be just like Cagney and Lacey, except prettier," Lowpepper was saying excitedly. Marango merely shook her head and said, "Oh no you don't. First it was Barney Miller, then Miami Vice, and then you went through your NYPD Blue phase, showing your ass to anyone who would look. You and I are not cut out to be detectives." Lowpepper was duly shunned. She shoved another spoonful of cream pie into her mouth and stared thoughtfully out the window. Karen noticed Lowpepper's jaw suddenly drop, bits of cream pie falling out into her lap. Resisting the urge to gag, Karen turned to see what had made Darlene allow food to fall out her mouth. She gasped, it was Carla Whipperforth and CT. They were getting out of Carla's papa's Porsche and getting ready to enter the restaurant. "Quick! Under the table, exclaimed Low Pepper, throwing her fork into the air and attempting to wedge herself under the table. Karen soon joined her, and they peered out from under the table as the two walked in and were seated on the opposite side of the room. The waitress appeared and glanced down at the two women under the table. She sighed. This wasn't the first time this had happened, unfortunately. She slipped the check under the table. A fat little hand grabbed it and another fat little hand put a 20 out. The waitress took it, sighed and walked away. We have to hear what they're saying, hissed Darlene. She and Karen looked around, vainly trying to figure out a way to get over by CT and Carla's table without being noticed. Karen grabbed Darlene's fat little arm and made a motion like she was swimming in water. The air ducts. Of course, whispered Darlene. She and Karen got on their haunches, bounced 3 times and were crawling in the air ducts moments later. They were soon over Carla and CT's table, listening intently. So I dumped him like I dumped you, without mercy. Carla was saying. CT chortled and said, so are we gonna go swimming in the West Wing later? Carla nodded and looked at her watch. The vein began to twitch. Where is our waitress? She demanded. She sighed exasperatedly and motioned CT to get up. They were leaving. Low Pepper watched them go, her fat beady little eyes darting back and forth between the departing couple and a slice of apple pie on the table below her. CT and Carla were almost out the door when they heard a loud crashing sound, followed by a scream of, "My God, she's got a fork." Chapter 4. Gunther prepared to enter the clinic, sweat glistening on his brow. As he passed the plaque near the entrance, he stopped to read it, Brandy Low Pepper, Erection Facilitator. Gunther gulped. He pushed open the door and strode in. The lobby was dark, dirty, and had a peculiar smell to it. Gunther felt sure he recognized the smell but didn't want to think about it. From a small speaker in the wall, he heard the Muzak version of Come On Feel the Noise by Quiet Riot. He also saw several figures, all dressed in long black trench coats, sitting in folding chairs scattered about the room. "Hi Jim, hey Bob, how goes it Chastity?" he said, waving to the small group. Gunther went to the receptionist. Her platinum hair stood out in the darkness as did the enormous silver hoop in her nose. "Hey Mr. K," she said. "Hi Kitty. When is the soonest I can get in?" Kitty consulted her calendar. "In about 45 to 50 minutes, give or take." "Yeah, want the usual." Gunther's head bobbed up and down quickly as he took a seat next to Jim. He made special note to pull his jacket close to his body. He picked up a copy of In the Navy, special issue on Seaman from the magazine rack and settled in for the wait. As time passed, he would occasionally hear the muted moan, groan and yodel from behind the closed door next to the receptionist desk. Eventually, the lobby was empty. Chastity had just gone in and he knew this would be a quickie. The front door opened, and Gunther turned to survey who had come in. His mouth dropped in shock. "Jimmy!" he gasped. Jimmy nodded, shame evident on his face. He walked to Kitty, who gave him an icy stare. "Can I help you?" she exclaimed. "Hey Kitty, is Brandy available?" Kitty's eyes narrowed. "Is this a personal or professional visit?" Jimmy coughed and said, "A little of both." Kitty flashed him an insincere smile and said she'll be available as soon as she's done with Gunther. "There. Take a seat." Jimmy sat next to Gunther. They both smiled, that awkward smile you smile when in an elevator. "So?" said Jimmy. "So?" replied Gunther. The inner office door opened, and a blissful-looking Chastity floated out and left. Brandy emerged from the inner office, wearing an enormous white smock and goggles. She saw Gunther, nodded and then stopped dead in her tracks at the sight of Jimmy. Jimmy smiled weakly. "Ms. Low Pepper, this guy wants to see you when you're done with Gunther," said Kitty, barely concealing the contempt she felt for Jimmy. "Ah, come on Kitty. Don't be so hard on Jimmy. Jimmy, Gunther, and Kitty stared at her. I made funny, exclaimed Brandy, roaring with laughter. Gunther followed her into the inner office, closing the door behind him. Jimmy and Kitty sat in silence for a moment. So, what's new? Said Kitty, twirling her envelope opener in one hand. Not much. I saw Jerry. He's leaving Betty. Hey, do you have a copy of Big Chill Monthly? No. She sneered, flicking a stray piece of hair out of her eyes. Before Jimmy could respond, Gunther floated into the lobby from the inner office, grinning from ear to ear. He threw a 20 on Kitty's desk and left. Brandy called Jimmy in. He glanced once at Kitty in pity and followed Brandy into her office. Kitty watched them go, fuming. She let out a grunt of anger and jumped to her feet. She glanced upwards and in one swift move was off the floor and in the vents. She shimmied down the dark tunnel until she found herself over Brandy's office. She peered down through the grate at Jimmy and Brandy, who were having a conversation. She strained to hear them talk. And I think my lifestyle wasn't extravagant enough for her, so she left me. I need your help to get her back. Jimmy was saying. Kitty saw Brandy move to stroke her chin, stop, remove the gloves she wore and then continue. I suppose I could do that for you. But I'll need you to do something for me. Kitty saw Jimmy blanch. I told you before, Brandy, that baby isn't mine. Brandy shook her head, saying no, no. We did a paternity test and turns out it's. Kitty didn't hear the next part, but she saw the two of them laugh, long and hard. What I need, Brandy was saying, is you to do me a favor. My little brother Tab is doing bad in school. Ever since Mama made him retake the 8th through 12th grades over again, he's grown cold and bitter. Colder. More bitter. He needs help. Jimmy nodded and said, you got it? Where's he living nowadays? In the trailer park behind Farm and Fleet. Okie dokie. They shook hands. Kitty watched them, fuming. She would not allow Jimmy to reconcile with Carla. He didn't know it now, but he would be with Kitty instead. Kitty watched Jimmy leave and began to leave herself when she saw another door in Brandy's office open and something large walk out. It was Darlene Lowe Pepper. Her jowls were shaking with glee. Kitty was repulsed. She began slithering backwards down the vent and dropped back down to her desk, doing several backflips and a somersault in the process. She watched Jimmy leave and a look of concern crossed her face. He was obviously walking into a trap. But did she dare help him? Batman didn't like this one little bit. He had spent what seemed like an eternity fighting evil of all sorts. Each adventure, as absurd as some of them had seemed, had left him respecting the sanctity of life itself and appreciating the fact that it was up to him to fight evil, any evil. The evil that presented itself now was beyond comprehension though. Batman wondered if he would be able to stop this latest threat. I'm sorry sir, but you cannot return this item. It has obviously been damaged, the service desk clerk was saying. Batman sighed, tut-tut and pointed at the sign nearby. The clerk turned and looked at the sign. It read Farm and Fleet will gladly accept all returns, no questions asked. Yes, sir, I know what the sign says, but there are certain exceptions to that rule and this most definitely one of them. You simply may not return this George Clooney Batman doll since their last film was a flop. And besides, whatever you have done to this doll is frightening. Batman glanced down at the doll. One of its legs had been twisted up and around the head, the uniform was torn in several places and the teeth had been darkened with some sort of black marker, making the doll seem toothless. Batman snorted and began digging into his utility belt. Oh, I'll fill your little red wagon, he exclaimed. An idea suddenly occurred to him. He struck a heroic pose and said in his best Keaton, I'm Batman. Sir, please. There are others in line behind you waiting. Must I call security, again? Batman went pale. He grabbed the doll, stuck out his tongue at the clerk and stormed out of the store. Outside, Batman saw Robin bouncing up and down in the Batmobile. Batman opened the car's door and heard the Bat stereo crank to full volume. He switched the volume off and stared at Robin. "What are you doing, old chum?" Robin grinned from ear to ear and said, "I'm getting jiggy with it, Batman." Batman shook his head in condescension and started the Batmobile. As he was revving the engine loudly, Robin tapped him on the shoulder and pointed out the window. Batman looked and saw Jimmy traipsing across the field towards the mobile homes behind the building. What on earth is Jimmy doing going to see Tableau Pepper? Batman wondered aloud. He switched off the engine, jumped outside and motioned for Robin to follow him. Tableau Pepper sat on his porch in a rocking chair, a bottle of gin nestled comfortably in his lap. His hat was pulled down over his eyes and gentle snoring could be heard. Jimmy approached the trailer cautiously. He had only met Tab once before and the experience hadn't left him thinking favorably about the youngest Low Pepper. He stood in front of Tab and cleared his throat. The shotgun was out from behind the chair and in Tab's hands within a second. The barrel was pointed straight at Jimmy's head. "What you doin' on my land?" he spat. Jimmy gave his most winning smile and said, "I've just come to talk Tab." Tab considered this, lowered the gun and took a swig of gin. He wiped his mouth with the cuff of his sleeve and said, "I'm perdna sure I don't knows ya, but ya got's a trustworthy face. Wants some gin?" Chapter 4. It was a bright Monday morning. Darlene stood in her office at DOA, watching her reflection in the mirror. She was chanting, over and over, "I am thin and gorgeous." Shortly thereafter, Karen arrived, and they stood in Darlene's office, chatting. Karen told a joke. Darlene shook her head, she didn't understand. "Can I just say something?" said Karen. "Yes. You can never have enough hats, gloves, and shoes." The school bell rang long and hard. The 400-plus students ran like lemmings towards the single school door of DOA. After some pushing, grabbing and oiling up of various body parts, the children made their way into the fellowship hall and then into their desks, in rows of 20, 5 stacks high. Mrs. Low Pepper entered the classroom, clad in her usual nun habit. No one understood why she wore it, but if it made Darlene Low Pepper happy, no one dared question her motives. Low Pepper turned and nodded at Karen Marango as she entered at the other end of the room. The children all sat straight, eyes facing forward as Mrs. Low Pepper began her daily lesson. Several minutes into her speech about recognizing true evil, Alex Bennett, R.R., and why they weren't allowed to be left alone in the copier room anymore, Mrs. Low Pepper suddenly stopped her lesson and excused herself from the room. She went out into the fellowship hall, head cocked like a dog. Karen followed her out and was about to ask what was going on when Darlene shushed her. A few moments later, Darlene said, "The outer perimeter defenses have been activated. Someone's coming." The two women turned towards the wooden door next to the kitchen. It banged several times, the back door was open, and someone was coming in. Smoke began to filter from underneath the door and it swung back quickly. Blue and gray smoke billowed from the open doorway and filled the fellowship hall quickly. Coughing and sputtering, Darlene and Karen were just able to make out the vague outline of a figure dressed in black enter the room. "Who are you?" demanded Karen, trembling. A soft chuckle and then, "My name is Langley, Floyd Langley. I have come to discuss business." Darlene clung to Karen, gulped and said, "Well, what sort of a business?" "I wish to acquire the property this building is on. My company is expanding, and I wish to diversify my investments. This school will be one of them." Darlene stepped forward, timidly. She couldn't make out any features of this man named Langley. All she could make out was a long black trench coat, but the face was concealed by smoke which continued to pump into the room. "I'm not sure I understand, but I will certainly need time to consider this," Darlene said finally. Silence. Perhaps I could persuade you over dinner? I have a yacht in the harbor. We could meet tonight. Darlene considered. She suddenly felt herself being pushed aside as Karen moved towards Langley. I'd love to go, she said. Darlene made her decision. No, I should go. What time? 7 p.m. The name of the ship is Lollipop. She's a good ship. I shall await you with pleasure. Langley retreated backwards into the clouds of smoke which suddenly began to dissipate and finally vanished within seconds. The man was nowhere to be seen. Darlene and Karen stared at each other. Darlene parked the van, retracted the wings and activated the auto defense system. She got out and peered down the docks at the enormous black yacht parked in the harbor. It looked sinister, well, except for the big yellow smiley face painted on one side. She walked down towards it and was greeted by two large men, dressed in black suits. They nodded at her and threw her in the water. Her screams and the shouts of "Whale! Beached whale!" brought a cloud of smoke to the deck of the Lollipop. A finger pointed at her thrashing form in the water and the two men jumped in and pulled her out instantly. She was carried dripping wet to the deck of the Lollipop and placed gently on a deck chair. She shivered as the cloud of smoke approached her and she saw Langley's form bow. I must apologize for my men. They were not aware you were who I told them you would be. I told them a trim and beautiful woman was coming to visit me. They must have mistaken you for someone else, purred Langley. He handed Darlene a towel which she began drying herself with. She stood up, started shaking her body in a violent manner and within moments was dry. She took her seat and watched in fascination as the smoke surrounding Floyd Langley began to fade away, leaving a large man dressed from head to toe in black. He wore a large brimmed fedora hat which put a large shadow on his face. Try as much as she could, Darlene couldn't make out his features. Langley walked closer. He squelched when he walked. Darlene stared in apprehension. Langley commented, condensation. Langley took a seat next to her, steeped his fingers in contemplation and said, Diane, may I call you Diane? Darlene blushed and said, it's Darlene, actually. Thank you, Donna. Let me be quite blunt with you, I will have your school, one way or another. I need it as soon as possible and am willing to pay you top dollar for it. Why? Langley sighed and said, you see, Desiree, many years ago I lost my Christian perspective. The experience was both horrifying and strangely exhilarating. My doctor at the time was a close friend. Unfortunately, he disappeared several years later. My sources tell me he died in a mysterious school fire. That is all I know. Since then, I have been building a vast corporation. Today I am poised to take over control of the major United States business world. It shall be a brutal yet efficient takeover. My reasons for this are best left to myself, Deanna. I will have your school. Darlene jumped to her feet, angry. I will not sell my school to you. Whatever your intentions for it, they are not justifiable. This is one school principle you can't buy. A tray of exquisite food was wheeled onto the deck of Lollipop. Darlene quivered and felt her beliefs beginning to falter. The food was unsheathed to reveal scrumptious turkey, ham, pudding, and fig Newtons. Low Pepper's body began to shake noticeably. Langley was staring at her vibrating form intently. He made a sweeping hand gesture towards the food and said, it can be all yours, Daphne. What do you say? Sweat poured down Darlene's face as she stared at the steaming food mere feet away. Suddenly she screamed and went running off the yacht, arms waving around in the air. She ran up to her van, jumped in and Langley watched the vehicle speed away at high speeds. His men stood at his side, ready for an order. I knew Danielle would be able to resist. Now it is war, a war which will give me that school, and perhaps the revenge I seek. But I am an honorable man. Send them one last warning. Make it subtle. As Karen Marengo opened the strange package left on the steps of the church the next day, she had a sense of foreboding. The feeling turned true when she saw the bomb nestled inside the incredibly cute My Little Pony wrapping paper. She dropped the box and ran back into the church, slamming the door behind her. The bomb exploded, sending flaming shrapnel slamming into the front wall of the church. Several bricks were shattered and the small window on the front door shattered, spraying the inside entryway and the cowering Marengo with glass. She pulled herself to her feet as Darlene and several dozen children came running up from the basement. Darlene took one look at Karen and the damage and the vein began to twitch. "This is getting serious, Darlene. We're going to need help," complained Marengo, dabbing at the small cuts on her forehead. "I think perhaps we should call on some of our old student body to help us. If anyone has experience in childish warfare, it will be them. I'll start making the calls." Darlene peered out the window of the tower. For as far as the eye could see, there were black tanks, a cheery smiley face painted on each side. Atop one particularly large tank, she saw the black-suited figure of Floyd Langley. She knew the time was at hand. She switched on the church speakers and spoke, "This is Commander Low Pepper. The enemy is about to attack. I'm counting on all of you to do your best to protect this school which has served you for so long. For the rest of you, this will count as community service and get that jail time knocked down a bit. We must and will prevail. Now prepare yourselves, I've got a little trick up my blouse which will take them by surprise." Darlene switched the speakers off and pulled down the periscope. The enemy was getting ready to attack. She flipped a switch on the periscope and suddenly the wall slid away to reveal massive computer banks, filled with flashing lights and computer switches. She began flipping switches in an almost random order. Somewhere, the sound of machinery grinding to life could be heard. Darlene activated the speakers once more. "DOA, transform." Floyd Langley felt the ground tremble slightly and looked up at the school. It was beginning to move. Bits and pieces of it were revolving, spinning, and changing. Langley saw huge gun turrets and nests appear out of spots where brickwork and crosses had been. The tower shifted and suddenly became a huge cannon, aimed directly at their location. "Low Pepper is very clever for a fat woman," he tut-ted. DOA's transformation seemed to be complete. It was now a gleaming metal fortress with a 6-foot acid moat surrounding it on all sides. Low Pepper sat in the command center of the tower, beaming with pride and nibbling on a jelly donut. Langley gave the signal. His men began their attack. Brian ducked as bullets flew all around him. He had seen the DOA annex go up, taking CN and Chastity with it. He had been unable to save them. He suddenly stumbled as an explosion rocked the ground. He saw a section of street explode in flames nearby, the gas main shooting flames into the air. Then he saw it, one of Langley's men had made it through the front defense line and was headed for the school, a grenade in hand. Brian whipped up his pistol and shot the man dead, but watched in horror as the grenade fell from the dead man's hands and landed near a bunker, filled to the brim with new students, who were too young and stupid to realize their plight. Brian paused. This was his chance. If he threw himself on the grenade and saved these children, he would die heroically. His life had been a void ever since. Now was his chance to make something of himself. He began to run. Time seemed to slow down. Somewhere he heard a bugle, playing a charge anthem. It pushed him on. Tears washed down his face as he grew nearer his destination. Destiny was ready to collide head-on with Brian de Gaulier. He jumped into a ditch and felt the ground shake as the grenade exploded. He peered over the edge and saw the bunker filled with children explode. "Woo," he said, getting up and running inside the school. In disbelief, Darlene watched one of the outer walls of DOA crumble under the constant barrage of weapons fire from Langley. She cursed loudly at her situation. Most of her people had been killed or wounded and Langley just kept coming. She needed help, and she needed it now. As if some great and powerful force had heard her, Darlene watched in awe as white objects began dropping from the sky. She couldn't quite make out what they were or where they came from until one drew close to her. Its parachute opened and it landed safely several feet away. The white figure saluted and said "Ba ba." Mary Lou had come. Sheep wool was everywhere. Mary Lou, gasping for each deep, painful breath, managed to drag herself across the remains of the parking lot. The others fighting around her took no notice, sure she could do no harm. Soon, she reached the defective grenade. She examined it closely. There was a small piece of metal lodged in the firing mechanism. Mary Lou pulled a bobby pin from her hair and jammed it in. The small obstructive metal popped out. Mary felt a calm overtake her. After many adventures, some silly, some serious, it all came down to this, her last moment in existence. Sure, she had died plenty of times before and come back roaring mad and ready for more, but this time, she knew there would be no reprieve, no second chance. If she did this, it would be her final act. She started to pull the bobby pin back out and trigger the grenade when she stopped. Ghostly images were flashing before her eyes: Mrs. Murphy, candy samples, Teddy. They were waving goodbye. Little Mary Lou pulled the bobby pin out and laid back, waiting for the end to come. She suddenly felt a wetness on her face. She opened her eyes and saw it was beginning to rain. "Oh, shit," she exclaimed. The grenade created a crater the size of a small bus in the parking lot and took several of Langley's men with it. Mary Lou had not died in vain. With the resounding crash, the DOA tower crashed to the ground, sending debris and dust flying. Darlene watched in horror as Kitty and WK were crushed underneath the falling rock and plaster. As the dust began to clear, she saw Kitty's hand sticking out the rubble, still defiant, the middle finger raised slightly. Darlene jumped out of her tank and landed squarely on the ground next to Alex and Brian, who looked beaten and bloody. She grabbed a fallen student's rifle and started marching towards the enemy. She saw Floyd Langley's mist-shrouded head pop out from behind cover. She heard him chuckle. Soon, they met in the middle of the street. Darlene was breathing heavily from all the exertion. She noticed Langley didn't have a speck of dust on his clothes anywhere. "So, do you concede defeat?" was his simple question. "I don't understand how you could have beaten us," she wheezed. "Quite simple, my dear. Your ranks are not as trustworthy as you think. Gaining the necessary information about your defenses and so-called strategies was quite simple with the help of my man." Darlene stared in horror as Langley motioned behind her. She turned slowly, realization dawning on her face as the traitor was revealed. Alex Benetton sneered at her. "Oh, don't look so surprised, you fat-assed pork-chop-eating bitch. I've been waiting for revenge ever since you made me apologize for threatening to kill Mike Gladegarden fresh." Darlene dropped to her knees, whimpering. The shock was too much for her. "Oh, and I had help, dearie," Alex said, pointing. Darlene was on the verge of mental collapse. Alex was pointing at Jimmy, who lay wounded in a nearby ditch. He looked at them, shock evident on his face. "No. You're lying." Darlene began breathing heavily as she got to her feet. She lifted her rifle and faced Alex. Her eyes turned as cold as night as she pulled the trigger. Bullet after bullet slammed into Alex's body and he went pale, stumbling backwards and finally blown off his feet by the shock of the repeated blasts. Brian watched, stunned. He knew Alex was tricky, but to have given the enemy the advantage in this situation and let friends and loved ones die needlessly. Brian suddenly noticed Darlene swing the rifle around to train it on the helpless Jimmy. Brian gasped and began running. He knew Alex was lying about Jimmy. Something was wrong here. Alex had fought tooth and nail with them, and to just concede to being the enemy and place the blame also on Jimmy's shoulders didn't make sense. Besides, Jimmy was too pure of heart to be a part of Langley's team. Brian saw Darlene's fat little fingers tightening on the trigger and knew that he was too late to stop her from firing, but he wasn't too late to save Jimmy. Time seemed to slow down as Brian leapt through the air, trying to place himself between the bullets from Darlene's gun and Jimmy's helpless form. 4 bullets were flying from the barrel of the gun. They pumped into Brian's flying body and slammed him to the ground. Darlene, seeing what she had done, stopped and fainted dead away. The thought was just too much for her. Brian fell to the ground, mortally wounded. He twitched and spasmed for a few moments, and then was still. Meanwhile, inside the Accudyne plant, the president sat at his desk fuming. Reports of destruction in a 17-block radius, not to mention various dings and dents to the Accudyne employee cars, had sent him into a rage. His company had been putting up with those rotten little kids from DOA for too long. He flipped a switch on his desk, and it transformed into a nuclear arming device. Time to end this, once and for all. Darlene was coming round. She scrambled to her feet and watched in curiosity as Langley and his troops were retreating to their aircraft. She looked around wildly for Jimmy, but he was nowhere to be found. She saw Trudy come running up. "Commander. It's Accudyne, they've activated their nuclear device. It's set to go off in 5 minutes. We have to get out of here." Darlene screamed with frustration but knew she had to get her surviving troops out of there. Pulling a bullhorn out of her purse, she called out, "We're pulling out. Fall back to the battle van. Retreat. Retreat." She began running with Trudy for the red van, which miraculously had survived all the destruction and sat peacefully on the corner of Jackson and Ravine. The only survivors to join her were Karen, Carla, and CT. They clambered in and Darlene jumped into the driver's seat. "Hang on!" she exclaimed, activating the engine and engaging the flight controls. A pair of jet engines slid out of the back of the van and wings slid out on either side. The engines flared to life and the van rumbled and began to ascend, slowly but surely. Reaching a high altitude, the red van shot away into the darkening sky. In the back of the van, the seriously wounded Marengo stared out the rear window, back at the shrinking city of Janesville. A bright flash suddenly filled the sky and she saw the tiny reddish-yellow mushroom cloud envelop the entire town. Janesville was gone. Darlene put the van on autopilot and joined the others at the back, watching the numerous explosions and fires burst and blossom below. "It must be thousands of degrees down there," CT said. "Cooler by the lake," countered Karen. Chapter 5. The broken spoon lifted off of Brielle and sped into orbit. In the observation lounge, Alejandro watched the planet fall away to be replaced with the black nothingness of space. He heard footsteps behind him and spun around, not quite accustomed to having a body instead of the life unit. It was Dweezil. He held in his hands the DNA capsule. He handed the capsule to Alejandro and stood back, silent. Alejandro took the capsule and stared at it intently. "I can bring them all back with this," he said finally. "They've lived and died so many times, isn't it time to just let things end here?" Alejandro considered. He thought of the years that had passed and the number of times he'd brought them all back in his mad quest for power and crazy adventures. It had seemed much more fun then. Now that he had his original body back plus thousands of years of experience, it all seemed pointless. He wanted to go home and start again with new characters. Alejandro lifted the capsule high above his head and threw it against the wall. With a loud crack, the capsule split apart and fell in shattered pieces to the floor. Dweezil and Alejandro watched the DNA molecules inside spread across the floor, dying almost instantly. For the first time in decades, Alejandro cracked a smile. It was over.